Hey, and welcome to the Midnight Quilt Show. Have you ever had the best idea for a quilt pattern and then the hardest time actually making it? That's tonight's quilt. I thought I was being so clever with a creative design and it took me forever to write the pattern, but I finally got it figured out, I think. Anyway, it's a free pattern, so make sure you download it. Let's get to it. So I'm using this white solid and this easy breezy blue roll of pre-cut strips out of Boundless Solids to make a modern X quilt. Here you can see I have my seafoam green, my full bobbin dark green, my happiness blue, all the perfect colors I need to make my modern X quilt. Well, I don't have to cut these yet, but I do need to cut the background, so let's get to it. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut a couple strips out of my background because I need just a few more than what comes in that pre-cut roll. Then I'm going to cut some really big squares out of the background fabric. Then some slightly bigger squares, which I'm going to cut in half diagonally to make some triangles. I'm not going to lie, coming up with the math for this quilt really threw me for a loop. And I'm not super proud to admit that my teenage daughter helped me with it. It's like you leave high school and you forget all the math you're supposed to learn. So I have some big triangles, some big squares, and then I actually do have to do a little bit of cutting on the pre-cut strips. So some of these strips are actually going to get cut to 2 inches. I looked and looked and could not find pre-cuts that were already 2 inches exactly, but that's all right. I don't mind doing a little bit of cutting. And you even have a little piece of, string to tie up presents or to make pretty confetti, whatever you need that for. So I'm going to pick groupings of these and cut them into 2 inches. Isn't that pretty? It was kind of fun going up to my 12-year-old daughter Chloe and saying, "Could you help me with my homework? Mommy's not sure what width these strips need to be to fit on the angle." She only teases me about it a lot. So I'm going to finish trimming these to 2 inches, and then I'm going to take my untrimmed strips and make a 36 patch block. That's right, it's 4 times as fun as a 9 patch. Okay, the first block in this quilt was pretty easy. Even I could figure it out with the math, and we're gonna make a 36 patch block, which sounds very complex and interesting, but really I'm just sewing 6 strips together to make a strip unit. This is where the background strip is coming into play, and I'm just picking out colors that I think look nice together. There's no specific color placement, so all I have to do is sew the strips together in groups of 2, sew those groups together, and I'll have my big strip unit. So the first strip unit has been put together, it's been pressed, and now I need to subcut it into 2.5 inch strips. So that one's all cut up. All I need to do is make 2 more strip units, cut those up, and then I'll show you how to make the 36 patch block. So I have my 2.5 inch strips here, and I'm gonna lay them out in a grouping of 6. Now, even though I have 3 different strip units, what I can do is play with the orientation of the strips, maybe rotate them to make it look more random and end up with a pretty fun effect. So maybe this one goes that way. Try not to worry too much if one color is next to another, it's gonna be fine. So I think that looks pretty good right there. And what I'm gonna do is just sew them together in groups of 2 and then sew those groups together. So the first block is done, my first 36 patch. I just need 7 more, which I've already got finished. And look how beautiful those blues and greens are. Now I'm gonna start sewing together those strips that I trimmed earlier, and we're gonna start cutting on the diagonal. So now my next strip unit is going to use these 2 inch strips that I trimmed earlier, but they're gonna be laid out slightly different. That means one is gonna start out here, the next one is gonna be offset by a couple of inches. I mean, about 2. You don't have to measure it super hardcore, just make sure it's kind of close. And the next one is gonna go right here. And what that's gonna do is let us get a lot of diagonal out of the strip unit. Well, I'm gonna get to sewing. So this strip unit is finished, and you can see how it kind of goes down to the side. I went ahead and pieced the other 2 kinds that we need to make. This one is supposed to somewhat be on the same level, and then the next one is going to angle down the opposite direction. So now that we have the 3 kinds of units, we gotta start cutting these on the diagonal. And this is where I really felt like I was on an episode of Are You Smarter Than a 5th Grader? So for this first unit, I'm gonna get very comfortable with the 45-degree line on our ruler because that's what's gonna help make these cuts. So So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to place that 45-degree line along the bottom of my strip unit and slide it over so that I can make my first cut right here. Now this is where you want to take your time, measure it out. You don't want to be in a rush. I'm just saying, it never usually ends up well for me when that happens. And I'm going to trim that 45-degree line just like that. So now I'm going to cut another diagonal line, but it's going to be the opposite direction. And I want the length of this to be 18¼ inches. It's a very specific number. It's not 18. It's not 18½, it's not even 16 7/8. I've learned by trial and error. So the best way for me to do this is I'm gonna take the point of my block unit and put it on the 18¼ inch. So I'm looking to 18¼ perfect. That's how long that's gonna be. And then from this point, I'm gonna cut my diagonal line going that way, using that 45-degree line on my ruler to position it just so. Now I'm looking at that 45-degree line, making sure that it's running along the edge of my strip unit. If it's tilted or if it's off, I'm gonna get a strip unit that's not gonna fit. Line it up, and I'm gonna cut right here. So then I have a parallelogram. Wait, I'm sorry, Chloe told me this is a trapezoid. So I'm sorry, I was never good at geology in high school. Just kidding, I know it's geometry. But this is the shape that I wanna get. So I'm gonna cut one more out of that strip so I get 2 of those trapezoids. This time, since the angle's going this direction, I'm gonna put that point on my 0 line, come over here, make sure it's going nice and straight. I'm gonna look for the 18¼ I'm gonna get my 45-degree line, line it up on there, and put it right in place. And now I have 2 trapezoids, and you're gonna see the color placement's gonna be a little bit different, but that's what's gonna add to the scrappy look of this quilt. Now I have this piece left over, but we're not finished with it yet. I'm gonna do 2 more regular 45-degree cuts to get some triangles out of this. So I'm gonna line up the 45-degree angle, and you're gonna see that there's no fabric to line it up with, but I'm just looking to see that it's on track with the actual fabric. Another thing you can look for, since we're just doing a regular 45-degree angle, is I'm looking to see that the fabric lines up against one of these lines right here. And I have my triangle. I know what shape that is. Chloe didn't have to help me with that. And then I'm gonna cut another 45-degree angle out of here. And again, lining my 45-degree angle up with the bottom, making sure that it meets up at that point, and then trimming carefully. So each regular strip unit is gonna give me 2 trapezoids, 2 triangles. Now it's time to cut up those other strip units. Okay, for the strip unit where we have them offset, the first thing I'm gonna do is cut a 45-degree angle that's gonna kind of trim off all that extra so we can start cutting out our parallelograms. So lining up that 45-degree line, I told you were gonna get really comfortable with it, and then trimming it to get our first line. All right. Now this time, instead of cutting my next line at an opposite angle, I'm gonna cut it the same angle, and that's where that parallelogram comes out. Now that's gonna be 9¾ inches. Again, something I found out through trial and error. So I'm gonna put the point of my strip unit on that starting line, and then I'm gonna go to 9¾ and cut a diagonal line there. Now I had this great idea for the quilt. I thought I could either paper piece it or cut diagonals, and I thought, you know what, I'd rather just cut diagonals. Take your time, this is very important because that's gonna give me the correct cut on the other side. 9¾ and then cut. And there is my first parallelogram. Isn't she pretty? Now I'm gonna cut a few more of those out of the strip. All right, it's time to cut up this strip unit. I'm still making parallelograms, except this time they're angling the opposite direction. They're still gonna be the same length, still gonna be the same look, just different direction. So I have my trapezoids, 2 different angles of parallelograms, and some triangles. Let's start putting these into blocks. The first block we're gonna make uses one of our trapezoids and one of our triangles, and I'm gonna place the fabric so that it looks scrappy. So I think maybe these 2 will look nice to each other. So when I lay it like this, I'm gonna fold it over and sew that together. But here's the thing, we're gonna have some different points on our blocks. These pointier ends are gonna extend past those shorter ends. So if it doesn't look the right size, that actually means you've done it right. I'm gonna lay it right on top of each other, make sure it's centered, and then go ahead and sew it together. When I pull that away, then I have a triangle that looks nice and striped, but it's actually gonna be part of a half square triangle. So those bigger triangles that we cut earlier, they're actually gonna line up like this. So I'm gonna fold it over, line them up, and I'll have my first big block. So the reason I wrote the pattern this way is it makes the color placement more random and saves you fabric. Plus, I didn't want to get into paper piecing or foundation piecing. Believe me, I wrestled with this a long time. That's why you should go download it, because I took all the time to write this free pattern for you. It's in the description box below. Now I'm gonna make 8 more of these, but first I'm gonna show you the next block. Okay, the next block we're gonna make isn't gonna be a cool arrow block, although if I'm gonna play around, that's kind of fun. I'm just saying, but that's not what we're working on today. I'm gonna take one of my parallelograms, and it's going to get a triangle on either side. Now I get a stripy triangle block that doesn't have a lot of fabric waste, but is also random in the fabric placement. So all I have to do now is sew it to either side. But here's the thing that we need to have a discussion about. Some of these fabrics are gonna be on the bias, they'll be a little bit stretchier. You have to be careful sewing them together because you could easily stretch them out. I'm gonna line up those 2 sides and then sew it on. There's half of it, and the other half is gonna sew on just like that. I'm gonna line up the 2 pointy angles right here, and that means up here, that's gonna extend past that one. That's what it's supposed to look like, and sew it together. Now that is a pretty rectangular block, and I'm gonna do the same thing with the other parallelogram going the opposite direction so that I can make a striped V block just like that. So I have my 2 blocks, they're angling at opposite directions, and I'm gonna carefully sew them together to have my first V block. So now I'm gonna finish making my stripy half square triangles, my V blocks, and we'll get to lay out the first row of the quilt. I have all the blocks for the first 2 rows of this quilt, and this is where we really get to see the modern X come together. So we're gonna use our 36 patch block, one of our stripy half square triangles, and because I'm so tired of all the piecing, we had to have a nice big easy solid block right there of the white fabric. This is where I'm gonna have lots of fun with the quilting. And then the same on the other side, just like that. The second row is very much like the same with my stripy half square triangle. Another 36 patch, except this time, instead of the solid piece of fabric, we're going with that stripy V, right? Love it. And this is what it's going to look like. Before I get to sewing, let's just talk about how these come together. In this block, what I have is a straight of the grain cut and a bias cut. So since these are diagonally cut, they're gonna stretch a lot. In theory, in a perfect world, those are gonna line up so beautifully, it'll bring tears to your eyes. But honestly, if there's any variation in the piecing or the cutting or the assembly, they're not gonna line up. So let's just do this. Let's just say they're not supposed to line up, and if they do, it's a bonus. All right, I'm gonna sew together these 2 rows, and then we'll see how the middle comes together. Well, it's finished, and the great news is I have some piecing that is not fantastic, but I'm gonna show you how to hide it with the quilting. So I'm gonna make a sandwich and get to the machine quilting. So in those instances where the piecing isn't quite perfect, you have to know that the quilting is gonna make it a lot better. So what I'm gonna do is where these strips kind of end here, I'm gonna use the quilting to extend it into the background. And that's gonna help draw attention to the center of the quilt instead of any areas that have maybe less than perfect piecing. So using my ruler, I'm gonna quilt a straight line along this seam, extend it out to here, and this is gonna create my space that I'm gonna fill in. And I think to fill it in, I'm gonna alternate, I'll alternate between back and forth lines and wishbones. Those are my 2 favorite go-to quilting designs. And if it looks as good as it does in my head, I think I'm gonna love it. Well, let's get started. So now that I've filled in this area with the wishbone design, even treating this as though it were the piecing, now I'm gonna do a different design in the next row right here. I think I'm gonna do that back and forth line just so it gives it a nice contrast. Let's see how it turns out. And now you can see the fun texture that those 2 designs are adding to it. And eventually I'll come back and add another line of quilting here and fill that in. But in areas where the piecing does look good, such as my 36 patch block where some of the points actually match up, I'm going to use a continuous curve design. Since that design is going to come to each of the points, that's going to highlight the fact that this is one area that actually got pieced perfectly. Now I could actually quilt the whole block at one time, but I'm going to just fill in this 4 patch so that you can see what it looks like to do a whole area continuously. The main idea is not to worry about your curves being perfectly curved. Instead, focus on those points and try to make the lines cross at the points. When quilting the continuous curve design, especially if I'm filling in a grouping, I'm going to start from one point and quilt my curve down to the next. Then from there, I'm going to quilt a line that almost is a serpentine. It's going to go above the seam, then below the seam, crossing at that point. When I get to the edge of my area, I'm going to quilt back the way I came, going the opposite direction, curving above and then below, then another curved line to get to the bottom. Well, I've got a lot of work to do between the back and forth lines, the wishbones, and the continuous curve. I think this is going to turn out amazing. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, don't worry. I have some free quilting diagrams that you can download, as well as the free pattern. You can check out all that information in the description box below. Well, I'll see you when this quilt's finished. Well, this quilt is finally finished, and I have to say, making it was a lot better than coming up with all the math and the shapes that make up this quilt. But between piecing the strip units, making the 36 patch, and of course, enhancing the piecing with the quilting, I had an amazing time. And don't forget, you can get the free pattern and quilting diagrams. Just check out the information in the description box below. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any Midnight Quilt Show episodes. And I would love for you to comment and let me know if you think you're going to tackle the Modern X quilt. And don't be sad, but I'm taking just a little break. But I'll be back soon. In the meantime, you can go watch older episodes of the Midnight Quilt Show. I'll see you then.